Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Riley Lewis Show. I'm your host, Riley Lewis. We have a lot of news to cover today, so let's just jump right into it as usual. So, today we start off with a mandate for all Californians to wear masks in public from the Governor Gavin Newsom. This is a story coming to us from the Los Angeles Times, which we've been covering recently for some internal distress they've been undergoing. In any case, we begin again with a mandate from California Governor Gavin Newsom that requires residents of California to wear masks or face coverings of some kind when in public. There are a lot of different stipulations and rules and exceptions and little bugaboos about this, but the order generally comes amid concerns about the reopening of California and the spread of the coronavirus, which, again, is something we've been talking about recently because it's interesting that we sort of cared for a while, but then when there was the right political cause, we stopped caring. But now that political cause is being addressed, we can go ahead and actually go back to it. But without getting into all the politics of it and getting positional, Newsom released a statement about his decision to issue this order, saying the following, quote, "Simply put, we are seeing too many people with faces uncovered," which I agree with, putting at risk the real progress we have made in fighting the disease. So to his credit, I do agree that I see way too many people who are in close quarters with people who are socializing, who don't necessarily wear a mask, and sometimes this is even me, and I have, I acknowledge that masks are helpful in those instances, but, at least for partially containing the spread of the virus. But that said, we have had multiple conflicting reports, even in that Lancet article that I covered last week, or earlier this week, in which the authors basically said that they had low certainty in their results that masks help, completely. So, again, this is really hard for Americans who really just want to know mask or no mask. But again, my default would be in public spaces, mask. Especially if you're around family members, children, or you have grandparents, aunts, uncles, older parents. In any case, this is only about wearing a mask. Thankfully, this isn't about shutting down the economy again, which is something that I have expressed concern about because I do not think that we could handle that. So it's good that we're not doing that. This is just about wearing a mask. It's not about a shutdown, which, by the way, as far as economic shutdowns, that has been proposed. That's been proposed in New York City. That's been proposed in Houston. That is not an idea that I am making up. That's an idea that's actually being proposed, and that's something that I don't think that we could handle, especially after the first one, considering that we only got one check for $1,200. People's bills and just living costs more than that. So anyway, in any case, Gavin Newsom, the governor, also said California's strategy to restart the economy and get people back to work will only be successful if people act safely and follow health recommendations. That means wearing a face covering, washing your hands, and practicing physical distancing, which is true, and honestly, that's kind of mild. I know on the surface it seems maybe like an overreach, and in some ways I think it kind of is, but honestly that does seem pretty mild. It just seems like he's saying be courteous, just have common decency and be courteous, which I don't think is terribly unreasonable, especially considering that California has been something of a hotspot in the United States. Nothing like New York or Seattle, but Los Angeles County, for example, which was definitely one of California's major hotspots, had nearly 3,000 reported deaths, or I should say, as of now, has nearly 3,000 reported deaths from the virus. Although, again, we should mention the fact that the reports are. I wouldn't want to see the actual numbers in the sense that we know certain deaths are labeled coronavirus deaths, and those deaths don't necessarily include a situation in which it's a perfectly healthy person who succumbs to coronavirus and only coronavirus alone. A lot of times, I guess what I'm saying in other words is that some of these deaths, I should say, we know are coupled with other things that increase someone's proneness to illness. Sometimes that's something as explicit as an autoimmune condition, which I actually have myself. Sometimes that's something more, something more subtle, like hypertension or diabetes. In any case, I would like to know how many totally healthy people have actually succumbed and then died to the virus, and I'd like to know the average age. I'd also like to know how many people, again, with strong immune systems succumb to the disease. In any case, I'm not a medical expert or anything. And the good news here, which I want to focus on, the good news about this is that there are several important exemptions in this mandate, such as when eating food, including at restaurants, drinking, or socializing outside at a distance. So again, this is a very mild order. This has got a lot of different stipulations. On the surface, it seems like it's a lot of rules and it's just more overreach. But honestly, if you actually go online and read through the stipulations, it's pretty mild. You can take your mask off when you're eating in a restaurant. Restaurants aren't closed down. People are still at the beaches in San Diego. So it's actually fairly mild. I think this is actually pretty emblematic of. I mean, I don't think Newsom's handled this like well, totally, to be completely honest. I think in some aspects it's been a little much. But that said, again, it's hard to know. If we hadn't done what we did do, would we still be in the same position? It's hard to know. If we hadn't socially distanced in the past, would the virus have spread more? It's hard to know, and I have a hunch that that answer is yes. So, I mean, maybe all of this did work. In any case, again, Newsom has waited a really long time to do this. He's comparatively, someone like Andrew Cuomo has been much more eager to step in and intervene, but Newsom's honestly been pretty laissez-faire about this, and he did wait a long time. And I think that's because he wanted to give people a chance, and he also has been able to, listen to the feedback of Californians who really don't want to wear a mask, or people who have demonstrated, or maybe people even who are like calling or writing into him. I don't know. But arguably what forced his hand in this case is reckless behavior that I definitely can attest to from people on the street. So I guess I would say the sooner that people behave responsibly and we just hunker down and get through this, the sooner we can get back to normal. That said, you don't have to wear a mask everywhere. Go online and read the rules. It's really only in a few key places: healthcare facilities, nursing homes, nurseries for around children. Like they're really own, but you can still go to restaurants, you can still go to the beach, you can still go to work, you can go back to work. So this is honestly pretty mild in a lot of ways. In any case, let's move on to something that I don't really think is mild, which is the Supreme Court of ours, which is really morphing into Congress as it starts to move away from litigation and closer to legislation. Again, this brings us really to our next story, again, which is really touching on this, and for me, this very important theme in contemporary American politics, which is checks and balances. We have, I think personally, that this year we've honestly seen the executive, judiciary, and legislative branches all overreach in various ways out of their designated constitutional boundaries, and I don't think that that's a good thing, and I think that Americans are catching on to this. And really, without, again, debating the democratic or not democratic at all nature of a bench of 9 people who serve lifelong terms, who are not elected officials but appointed by a president, who are able to just completely change large swaths of policy and American lifestyle and culture with just a simple vote. I mean, without even getting to the fact that I don't think that's democratic at all. I think I think they have way too much power. And the fact that the original intent, again, of the Supreme Court was to have a judiciary system independent of Washington that could tell us whether or not a law that is being proposed or that is on the books is in violation of some constitutional right. In any case, there have been a string of recent decisions made by the Supreme Court that I actually agree with, by the way, that I just think set a dangerous precedent because I think it's a violation of power or an overreach. The purpose of the Supreme Court, like any other thing, is what it does, meaning that the point of the Supreme Court is to, again, determine the compatibility of a law with the United States Constitution. However, in recent years, especially the last 5 years, the Supreme Court really has effectively been legislating because there's a gridlocked Congress, and they figure, well, if Congress can't legislate and create laws, then we'll just basically de facto be the legislation. And again, I may even agree with the decision, which I do about the 6-3 decision about defending sexual orientation and gender identity. I actually agree with that decision. I think that's a good thing, but I think that should have been a law passed by Congress, not a law that was, or a law basically, or the Civil Rights Act law of 1964 that just gets updated or rewritten, or renegotiated or re-legislated by the Supreme Court. I want the Congress to do that. I want the Congress to come up with a bill, and then I want the Supreme Court to look at it and say, is this in accordance with the general theme that's set forth in the Civil Rights Act of 1964? And if that is the case, then that is a good thing. And I think that is still, though, the job of the Congress. The job of the Congress is to legislate. The job of the Supreme Court is to interpret the law and tell us whether or not it violates the Constitution. And they're slowly encroaching on legislation and abandoning their role as litigators, and especially as independent litigators. I really think that this blur between the checks and balances on each branch is really unbecoming. And honestly, again, all three branches, in my opinion, have violated their constitutional duty at some point in the last 5 years. And really, arguably, even in this year, in 2020. That's something for another episode, but in any case, there is a piece at the Washington Post where Michael Scherer highlights some of the rhetoric that we are seeing currently from both President Trump and Joe Biden about the need to either put a conservative or a liberal justice on the Supreme Court, which is exactly demonstrative of what I am saying and my point, which is that this organization is increasingly becoming about legislation and partisanship instead of independence and litigation. And it's not supposed to be about putting a conservative or a liberal judge on the court so that you can get your agenda pushed through and make campaign promises to people. The whole point of the Supreme Court, again, is to defend the people and the people's document, the Constitution, and the laws on the books. If we don't like the laws on the books, we should go into Congress and we should change the laws. We should rewrite them. And I think that it's really crazy that we have, Trump and even Biden doing this. For example, Biden, who has reportedly said that he's interested in a woman of color for the bench, which I think would be a good thing, generally. The point is, he's not interested in someone who cares about the law first and foremost. He's not interested in someone's training or credentials first and foremost. He's interested in characteristics of how they were born, features of what they look like, or who they are on the outside, which is totally just, again, surface level as it appears. And similarly, the president is claiming that a Biden presidency would greatly threaten conservative influence on the bench, but the bench is not supposed to be about any kind of influence. The bench is supposed to be just the bench. And that's the problem. And from where I'm sitting, the Supreme Court really, again, should be always about promoting the Constitution, the rule of law, and popular sovereignty, meaning supporting laws when laws are changed, and being able to adapt to times as culture changes and our politics change, so do our policies. But that should be happening in Congress, not the Supreme Court. And yet, that's exactly what's happening. And again, agree, which I do in this case, or disagree with the indecisions. Let me just ask you this question. I mean, really think about it. What happens when the minute comes along when finally there's someone in power that you don't like, that you did not vote for, who nominates a justice? Maybe that's happening right now under this term. Maybe it happened under the previous president. Maybe it'll happen under the next president, where there's someone that you don't like, who's young, who's nominated to the bench, and they're going to spend 30, 40, 50 years on that bench determining policies, legislating instead of litigating. How does that really it's rhetorical, obviously, but I just want you to let that sink in and think, how is that going to feel when, even if you like it maybe now, when it sets the precedent for later, and then one day it happens again and you don't like it, right? I think that some people might overlook stuff like this because it's convenient now, but it's not going to always be convenient. And I think stuff like this is going to come back to really haunt us. And, especially now with the stakes higher than ever, because we have many people in the Supreme Court who are really, reaching retirement age, by the way. Speaking of that, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is now 87 years old, says that she plans to retire sometime in the next few years, which means under the next administration. To that end, whomever is elected in November will most likely, certainly, have an empty spot on the bench to fill. And the Supreme Court currently has a 5-4 conservative majority. So Trump obviously wants to be reelected, especially so that he can appoint a new justice, someone that he thinks hasn't failed him as he thinks that Gorsuch has, because due to liberal decisions, especially coming from a conservative justice. However, Democrats are also making this a central theme in their message, including Joe Biden. Furthermore, the reason, again, that Democrats and Republicans really are obsessed with the Supreme Court is because politicians see that absent a functional Congress, the Supreme Court really is the de facto legislative branch that we have, except they have even more authority because it's a lifetime term, and their word is sort of the final word. And Democrats really are warning that the bench has not proven itself yet to be a liberal ally, so there are some key topics that will really be hot button issues and demonstrate the trajectory of the court in either direction. For example, the court is expected, in the near future to hear cases regarding the president's tax returns, limits on abortion in Louisiana, and even the organization and sort of, configuration of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Amid all of the hysteria, there really are a handful of I should say, yeah. So, despite all of this hysteria, there is a handful of hopeful and determined voices that really do think that the court actually can sort of return to its former, not former glory, but return to its role as a justice institution, not a political partisan institution. One of these voices is Brian Fallon, who's actually the executive director of a progressive organization called Demand Justice. Now, Fallon has said this about the court. He says, quote, "I don't think that people should form judgments yet about the trajectory of this conservative majority until these rulings are out." The part that few people are mentioning here, of course, is the fact that the court, again, is supposed to be a nonpartisan group of independent judges who serve life terms, which frees them from pandering in order to get reelected to the bench. They also don't have to have technical constituents or special interests because, again, they have a lifetime term. They don't have to worry about that. Of course, that's in theory, not in practice. And we've seen examples of politicians, even including the president, attempting to politically influence the Supreme Court. And not just this president, by the way. This has been happening since Thomas Jefferson tried to stack the courts in 1803. This has been happening. This has been a theme in American history, a very unfortunate theme. Worse yet, this happened, again, this might happen even under our next president. It really depends, but our next president will absolutely have the opportunity to nominate someone to the bench, and with that great power comes great responsibility, and I really hope that people start realizing that we need to return to the roots of the Supreme Court, which is about litigation and not legislation. And this article highlights another instance of this sort of influencing, by the way. This time, the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, who explicitly tried to intimidate Brett Kavanaugh and Justice Neil Gorsuch into voting for abortion rights, for example, saying that the two justices would have to pay a price if they did not vote in favor of Schumer's way, which, is intimidation of justices on the Supreme Court. In response, the conservative Chief Justice John Roberts, who was appointed in 2004 under George Bush, said that these sort of threats are dangerous, obviously, right? And that each justice will continue to do their job without fear or favor from whatever quarter, which is actually really, nice to hear. And I honestly think that if you look at the voting record, the fact that sometimes John Roberts, for example, does not toe the party line actually is an example of what he means. I think it's a good thing that we don't just stick to party lines and we don't look at the Supreme Court as just some machine to pass our agenda. The Supreme Court is supposed to be about justice. It's not about agenda. Now, Daniel Epps, who is a law professor at Washington University in St. Louis, had this to say about the recent behavior of Chief Justice John Roberts, saying that, quote, "The more the court continues to hand out victories to both sides in the culture wars, both sides in our political community, the harder it is for those kinds of proposals to get traction," which is true. And it's really sad that our Supreme Court is starting to really pander to political interests and party lines, as opposed to actually just upholding justice and the laws that are on the books. Again, we don't like the laws, that are on the books. We don't take it to the Supreme Court. I mean, sometimes we do, but we should be taking it to Congress and we should be changing the laws. That's the whole point of having a Congress. That said, let's move on in other news to the anniversary of Juneteenth, which is today, which is the anniversary that ends the official practice of slavery in the United States. It was 99, I believe. I forget how many years ago, I believe 1865 today, in Texas, the last African Americans who were held in chains were freed. Um, and this is a great holiday, again, yes, that marks the abolition of slavery in the United States. This began as a state holiday in Texas because that's originally where the last slaves were freed, but this eventually became a national holiday, especially as this sort of history comes to light more, with various publications, even including the 1619 Project. Like all things in politics, though, this holiday is being politicized, by people from all political persuasions, including the president, who's rattled off some nasty tweets, about agitators at his rally. And of course, meanwhile, the media decide to just claim that the president's racist, the entire country is racist and evil, and everybody just likes to make giant generalizations and just speak out of both sides of their mouth without really knowing what they're talking about or trying to make an actual point. Um, and by the way, it's this sort of mean-spirited journalism that drives people into the arms of people like Donald Trump. In any case, or the fact that this is also why our highest performing news organizations can't even match the viewership of one single episode of the Joe Rogan Experience. But in any case, I don't want to get into that. This is really about the celebration of liberating African American people, and that's what this should be about. This should be about remembering the day that African Americans were finally granted the rights that they are guaranteed to them in the Constitution, that were deprived for centuries in this country and on this soil. Additionally, this is about the memorial of the 1921 massacre of a neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, deemed or dubbed the Black Wall Street, in which hundreds of up and coming African American entrepreneurs and self starters and families and communities were generating wealth in their own economy, not by choice, of course, because they were legally segregated from the white economy. And hundreds of these people were slaughtered by vigilantes. Now, there's an article over at The Guardian, in which the author recalls this roaring progress of African American communities in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, following a string of what was reported then to be race riots and lynchings. Was really just a lot of, again, sort of, white vigilantes who did not like this up and coming African American economy. And some of these lynchings included really successful African American entrepreneurs such as Thomas Moss, Will Stewart, and even Calvin McDowell. Now, at the time, Tulsa was a strictly segregated community. So African American business owners had only African American employees and only African American customers, and they were completely deprived of participating in the white economy. So they had to make their own enterprise work strictly within their own, basically their own communities. Now, again, this article from The Guardian points out that it was an angry mob of white men 99 years ago that invaded this specifically African American neighborhood of Tulsa and basically completely set the city ablaze, tore down businesses, tore down buildings, broke glass, and started gunning and shooting people down. And they killed up to 300 people, burned down buildings, injured hundreds more. And essentially, this was just a large group of racist vigilantes who decided to terrorize, dehumanize, and further disenfranchise an entire community and group of people. And interestingly, we do see this sort of similar violent vigilante behavior today as people begin to resegregate themselves. I mean, in some cases you could argue around race, but also based on political affiliation. We're really seeing the legacy of this historical violence that really has been learned over generations. And as I have said before, violence perpetuates violence, and it's a really nasty cycle. And violence is something that I maybe hate the most, is hate. I really don't like violence of any kind. And again, so in honor of this evil portion of U.S. history, which is indefensible, deplorable, and truly terrible, it's important that we remember those who have been killed, who have been enslaved, beaten, segregated, disenfranchised, and silenced. And we should let this month and this day, Juneteenth, be a day of mourning, but also a day of celebration and connection to our long lost brothers and sisters who so horribly had to suffer under the doctrine of white supremacy, and so many of whom in chains as well. And I'd like to add also that millions of Americans in 2020, I think, really do want the best for everybody here. And I know so many good people in my life that really do want meaningful change and the best for everybody. And I think that we should let this day, usher in a new era of equality and re-enfranchisement and brotherhood and sisterhood. And I also think that it's good that companies such as Twitter, Nike, and even Target are declaring Juneteenth to be a paid holiday. That's an incredibly good thing. That's a great first step. That's giving it national recognition. That's a really good thing, especially a paid holiday. That's a really, really good thing. And this is a great thing for restoring a sense of community, shared identity, and shared values. And that is what America should be about. And I really invite you guys to think of ways in your own life that you can reflect on past injustice and how we can strive toward a more equal and a more loving future together. That said, that concludes today's episode. That is a wrap. I really appreciate your time today. I think that we had a really good conversation and there was a lot of news. There were a lot of things that I wanted to cover, but I did not have a chance to cover it. It's been a busy week for me in my personal life, but I want to end on this Juneteenth celebration because this is the Emancipation Liberation celebration, and it's just a really good thing. And I think that I want to end on that very positive feeling about that about change and progress and enduring and perseverance. So that's where I'm going to end. I thank you all for listening and supporting me here on YouTube or on Anchor. Again, you can also find me on anchor.fm. But you've been listening to The Riley Lewis Show. If you'd like to support me further, you can subscribe. Please hit that subscribe button down below. I really appreciate it. You can also like this video, leave a comment in the comment section down below and let me know how I'm doing. Or you can navigate to the link in my description of this video where you'll find my Patreon page. You can go to that website, then you can sign up and make a donation and support me, or you can just go to my virtual wallet on anchor.fm on the mobile application or the website. That's where to find me. That's anchor.fm/Riley-M Lewis, or you can find me at The Riley Lewis Show on YouTube. I will see you here again on Monday. Have a good weekend.